I never thought I'd be labeled a gold digger at my own wedding, especially by the family I was about to join. But when my father's helicopter landed on the vineyard grounds during our reception, sending champagne glasses trembling and white linens fluttering in the downdraft, everything changed. That moment revealed more than just my family's wealth. It exposed the true character of everyone present. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of whispers followed me like a shadow as I moved through my own wedding reception. "She's just after his family money," I overheard my new mother-in-law say to a cluster of relatives, not realizing I was just around the corner. "Classic gold digger. Look at that dress, those shoes. All carefully selected to look like old money. But I wasn't born yesterday." I stood frozen, the champagne flute cold against my palm, as my husband's aunt replied, "Poor James. So bright. So much potential. But men think with their hearts when they should think with their heads." My name is Olivia Chen. 6 hours earlier, I had become Olivia Chen Blackwell, wife to James Blackwell, heir to Blackwell Development, a regional real estate empire in New England. And now, at what should have been the happiest celebration of my life, I was hearing what my new family really thought of me. I had met James 3 years earlier at an environmental law conference in Boston. I was presenting research on sustainable urban development. He was there representing his family's company, which was making its first tentative steps toward green building practices. We bonded over our shared passion for environmental conservation, exchanged business cards, and began what I thought was a professional relationship. Neither of us mentioned our backgrounds during those early conversations. I didn't tell him I was the daughter of immigrants who had revolutionized aerospace engineering and built a fortune designing private aircraft. He didn't tell me his family owned half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. We were just 2 people who found in each other something genuine in a world that often felt performative and shallow. When we started dating 6 months later, I insisted on splitting every bill, taking turns planning dates, and establishing the financial independence that had been ingrained in me since childhood. My parents hadn't created their success by expecting handouts, and they hadn't raised me to seek them either. "Wealth is a responsibility, not a privilege," my father had always said. "Never let it define you, and never let others know what you have until you know who they are." So I kept my background private. I lived in a modest apartment, drove a practical electric car, and worked tirelessly building my environmental consulting firm from the ground up. James respected this, or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that his family had been conducting their own investigation into mine, searching for evidence of the fortune they assumed I was hiding. Finding none, my parents had always valued privacy and discretion. They concluded I was after theirs. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. There you are. James appeared at my side, handsome in his tailored suit, oblivious to what I'd just overheard. "My grandparents want to meet you properly. They just arrived from Florida." I plastered on a smile, pushing the hurt down deep where it couldn't show. Of course, I'd love to meet them. As James led me across the reception hall, I caught sight of my parents seated at a table near the window. My mother, elegant in her understated blue dress, was engaged in conversation with one of my college friends. My father checked his watch, discreetly, a gesture I recognized. He was calculating timing as he always did. For what? I wasn't yet sure. The Blackwell family had insisted on paying for the wedding. Tradition, they called it, though James later admitted it was more about control. They had selected the venue, their country club, chosen the menu, traditional New England fare that ignored my Chinese heritage, and crafted the guest list, heavy on business associates, light on my friends. I had conceded on most points to keep the peace, only putting my foot down on a few essentials like my dress designer and the ceremony music. My parents had offered to contribute multiple times, but I had declined, not wanting to become another point of tension. "It's not worth the battle," I told them during one Sunday dinner at their home. "Besides, this way they can't say I married James for financial support." My father had given me a long, measured look. "Sometimes, Olivia, letting people believe what's convenient for them teaches you who they truly are." Now, standing beside James as he introduced me to his grandparents, I was beginning to understand what my father had meant. "So you're the girl who captured our James," his grandmother said, appraising me through narrowed eyes. "From California. Aren't you? Your parents are in technology consulting," I supplied, the practiced half-truth coming easily. My parents' aerospace engineering firm did indeed consult on technology, just not the kind most people imagined when they heard the phrase. "Must be doing well enough," his grandfather commented, eyeing my simple pearl earrings as if assessing their value. Though not Blackwell, I imagine. He laughed heartily at his own joke, while James shifted uncomfortably beside me. "My parents worked very hard to give me opportunities," I said evenly. "I'm grateful for everything they sacrificed." "Sacrifice," his grandmother repeated, as if the word amused her. "Yes, I'm sure they did. And now their investment is paying dividends, isn't it?" Before I could respond, the wedding coordinator appeared at my elbow. "Mrs. Chen Blackwell, there's a situation that requires your attention. Something about an unexpected arrival?" "Excuse me," I said to the grandparents, relieved for the interruption. James squeezed my hand as I stepped away, a silent apology for his family's behavior. The coordinator led me toward the venue's entrance, speaking rapidly. "There's someone trying to land a helicopter in the East Field. The club manager is having a fit about liability and noise ordinances. They're claiming to be with the wedding party, but they're not on our approved transportation list." I stopped walking, a smile spreading across my face for the first time since I'd overheard my mother-in-law's comments. That would be my father. The coordinator blinked. "Your father arrives by helicopter?" "Only when he's making a point," I replied, quickening my pace toward the commotion I could now hear building at the venue's entrance. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Country club staff, wedding guests, and most prominently, my new in-laws, who were gesturing angrily toward the approaching aircraft. Its sleek form gleamed in the late afternoon sun as it descended toward the open field adjacent to the reception venue. "This is completely unacceptable," my father-in-law shouted over the growing noise of the rotors. "Who do these people think they are? This is a private event at a private club." My mother-in-law spotted me and marched over, her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone in the wind. "Olivia, do you know anything about this? This intrusion?" "Yes," I said simply. "That's my father." "Your father?" she repeated, disbelief evident in her voice. "Your father travels by helicopter?" Among other things," I replied as the aircraft touched down gracefully on the manicured grass, its rotors slowing but not yet still. The pilot's door opened, and my father emerged, Dr. Michael Chen, founder and CEO of Celestial Aerospace Dynamics, creator of the very aircraft he'd just piloted. Behind him, emerging from the passenger door, was a man whose face appeared on the cover of business magazines with such regularity that a collective gasp rose from the crowd. "Is that—" James had appeared at my side, his expression a mixture of confusion and awe. "Richard Torres, yes," I confirmed, naming the tech billionaire who had recently made headlines for his commercial space ventures. "He and my father are collaborating on a new project. I think they came straight from their meeting." As my father approached, dressed impeccably in a suit that probably cost more than the wedding venue rental, I saw understanding dawn on the faces of my in-laws. The whispers changed tenor immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. By the time my father reached me, embracing me warmly before shaking James's hand. The transformation in my new family's demeanor was complete. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance," my father said, though the gleam in his eyes told me he wasn't sorry at all. "Some meetings run long, and I didn't want to miss my only daughter's wedding reception." "Michael Chen," he introduced himself to my stunned in-laws. "Olivia's father. Your venue is quite remarkable, though the landing zone could use some improvement." He delivered this with such charming confidence that my father-in-law, usually quick with sharp comments, merely nodded in agreement. As they spoke, I caught my mother's eye across the crowd. She gave me a subtle nod that spoke volumes. This had been planned, not as a rescue, but as a revelation. My parents hadn't come to flaunt their wealth or embarrass anyone. They had come to expose the truth, not about our family's financial status, but about the character of the people I had just legally bound myself to. In a single moment, with the downdraft of helicopter rotors still stirring the air, everything had changed. And I knew this was just the beginning of a much longer story. The morning after my wedding, I woke up before James in our hotel suite, my mind still replaying the events from the reception. The helicopter landing had only been the beginning. What followed was an evening of whiplash-inducing behavior changes from the Blackwell family. People who had barely acknowledged my existence hours earlier were suddenly finding excuses to introduce themselves, to mention mutual acquaintances in the business world, to suggest lunch meetings and networking opportunities. I slipped out of bed and moved to the balcony, watching the sunrise over the Massachusetts coastline. The ocean stretched before me, steady and constant, unlike my new reality, which seemed to shift beneath my feet like sand. My story begins long before I met James or became entangled with the Blackwell family. I was born in San Francisco to Michael and Grace Chen, who had immigrated from Taiwan in the late 1980s with engineering degrees and a shared vision. They arrived with scholarships to Stanford's graduate program, minimal savings, and an unwavering belief in their ability to create something meaningful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My childhood memories are filled with the smell of circuit boards and mechanical drawings spread across our small apartment's dining table. My parents built their aerospace engineering consultancy from nothing, working 18-hour days while trading shifts caring for me. While other children had nannies or daycare, I had a playpen in the corner of their first workshop, a converted garage they rented from a sympathetic landlord who believed in their potential. "Watch, Olivia," my father would say, lifting me up to see his designs. "See how these parts work together? Nothing stands alone. Everything contributes." It was both an engineering principle and a philosophy of life that shaped my worldview, long before I understood its depth. Success didn't come quickly or easily for my parents. For years, they survived on research grants and small consulting contracts, pouring every dollar back into their business. Our lifestyle remained modest, even as their reputation grew. We celebrated small victories, moving to a 2-bedroom apartment, hiring their first employee, securing their first patent. Each milestone was treated as a family achievement, something we had all contributed to in our different ways. By the time I was 10, Celestial Aerospace Dynamics had 30 employees and had revolutionized certain aspects of helicopter blade design. By 15, my parents had contracts with major defense companies and were pioneering materials that would later transform private aviation. But our home remained modest, our family vacations centered around educational experiences rather than luxury, and my allowance remained tied to chores and academic performance. Money should be a tool, not an identity, my mother would say, as she taught me to maintain a balanced budget, even as a teenager. People who define themselves by wealth are hollow inside. They will always need more to feel complete. When I was accepted to MIT for environmental engineering, my parents could have easily paid my full tuition. Instead, they matched the scholarships I earned, teaching me that my education was an investment we made together. During college, I worked part-time in the sustainability office, lived with roommates in an off-campus apartment, and learned to navigate a world where many of my classmates came from obvious wealth and privilege. Why don't you ever talk about what your parents do? My roommate Zoe asked one night during our junior year. Everyone else here name drops their family connections every chance they get. Because what my parents do isn't who I am, I replied. It was a lesson I'd absorbed through years of watching them navigate an industry where technical brilliance mattered more than personal background. After graduation, I declined a position at my parents' now thriving company, despite the exceptional compensation package they offered. I need to build something of my own, I told them over dinner at their home. Finally, a spacious house in the hills overlooking the bay, purchased only after their company had become unquestionably successful. My father nodded, unsurprised. We didn't cross an ocean to hand you everything. We crossed it so you could have the freedom to choose your own path. I founded Green Meridian Consulting at 24, focusing on helping companies implement genuinely sustainable practices rather than performative environmental gestures. The work was challenging, the hours long, and the initial client list short. I lived in a studio apartment, worked from shared office spaces, and reinvested every profit into growing my expertise and reputation. When I met James Blackwell at that Boston conference 3 years later, I was just beginning to see substantive success. My client roster had expanded, I had hired 2 junior consultants, and Green Meridian was becoming known for its uncompromising standards and innovative approaches. I was delivering a presentation on integrating true sustainability metrics into corporate governance when I noticed him in the audience, attentive, engaged, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than superficial concern. Your approach is different, he said afterward as we exchanged business cards. Most sustainability consultants tell companies what they want to hear. You're telling them what they need to hear. Uncomfortable truths lead to meaningful change, I replied. Pretty lies just maintain the status quo. Our professional relationship developed naturally. Blackwell Development became a client of Green Meridian, implementing several of my recommendations for their new mixed-use project in Providence. James and I worked closely, our meetings extending beyond business discussions into shared interests. Contemporary architecture, wilderness conservation, climate-resilient urban planning. When he finally asked me to dinner, not as a client meeting, but as a date, it felt like a natural evolution rather than a surprise. What I didn't know then was that James had been fielding questions about me from his family since our first professional interaction. The Blackwells had built their real estate empire through 3 generations of strategic relationships and careful assessment of potential partners, or threats. A consultant who challenged their practices, who pushed for expensive sustainability measures, who had their heirs' attention, I represented an unknown variable in their carefully balanced equation. They've been asking about your family, James admitted 6 months into our relationship. We were hiking in the Blue Hills outside Boston, far from corporate boardrooms and family expectations. My father has people who look into the backgrounds of anyone associated with the company. And what did they find? I asked, curious rather than concerned. Not much, James said. Your parents own a technology consulting firm in California. You grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in San Francisco. You earned scholarships to MIT. You founded your company without outside investment. He smiled. You're refreshingly straightforward in a world of hidden agendas. I didn't correct his understanding of my parents' business. It wasn't a lie. Their company did indeed provide consulting services in advanced technology. The scale and specialization simply hadn't registered in the Blackwells' investigation. Perhaps they hadn't looked deeply enough, or perhaps my parents' characteristic discretion about their wealth and connections had served its purpose. When James proposed a year later, presenting a vintage emerald ring rather than the massive diamond his mother had suggested, I accepted with a full heart but clear eyes. I knew that marrying James meant joining a family with different values and expectations than my own. What I didn't anticipate was how profoundly those differences would manifest, or how quickly the facade of acceptance would crumble when tested. "They'll love you once they know you," James assured me as we planned our first dinner with his parents at their Beacon Hill home. "They're just protective of the family legacy." That dinner, and the many family events that followed, revealed a pattern that should have alarmed me more than it did. The Blackwells were unfailingly polite, but persistently probing, asking questions about my business model, my client acquisition, strategies, my long-term financial plans. They spoke of James's future in the company as if it were predetermined, despite his growing interest in green development that often diverged from their traditional approaches. "You've certainly had an influence on our son," Margaret Blackwell, my future mother-in-law, commented during one such dinner. "He used to understand that business decisions should prioritize returns, not idealism." "I think James understands that sustainability is both ethical and profitable," I replied. "Environmental responsibility is increasingly driving consumer choices and investment decisions." "Such modern ideas," she said with a tight smile. "We've managed quite well with traditional approaches for 70 years. As our wedding date approached, tensions increased. The Blackwells insisted on controlling most aspects of the celebration, from the guest list heavily weighted toward their business associates to the venue at their exclusive country club. Each time I suggested incorporating elements of my Chinese heritage or my own preferences, I was politely but firmly overruled. "Family traditions matter," Richard Blackwell, my future father-in-law, explained when I asked about including a tea ceremony. "The Blackwell name carries certain expectations in this community. I compromised more than I should have, choosing my battles carefully and consulting my parents only on decisions I felt were truly important. They offered support without interference, respecting my desire to manage the situation independently. Marriage is between two people," my mother reminded me during one particularly frustrating wedding planning week. "But family dynamics last a lifetime. How you navigate this now sets the pattern for your future." Her words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have anticipated as I stood on that hotel balcony the morning after my wedding, watching the sunrise and contemplating the dramatically altered landscape of my relationship with the Blackwells. My father's helicopter arrival had done more than create a spectacle. It had exposed motivations and assumptions that had been carefully hidden beneath polite veneers. James stirred in the bed behind me. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. "Thinking about yesterday?" I turned to look at my husband, wondering how much he had observed of his family's transformation, how deeply he understood what had been revealed. "I'm thinking about truth," I said carefully. "About what happens when perceptions suddenly shift, but reality hasn't changed at all." James sat up, running a hand through his tousled hair. "You mean my family's reaction to your father's entrance?" It wasn't a question. I've never seen my mother backpedal so quickly in her life. "I'm still the same person I was before the helicopter landed," I said, returning to sit on the edge of the bed. "My values haven't changed. My work hasn't changed. The only thing that's different is their perception of my family's financial status." James took my hand, his expression serious. "I know, and we need to talk about what that means for us going forward." As the morning light strengthened, illuminating our first day as husband and wife, I knew we were facing a fundamental choice about the foundation we would build our marriage upon, and the boundaries we would need to establish with the family, whose true colors had been so vividly displayed. "We need to establish boundaries," I told James as we sat on the balcony of our hotel suite, the morning ocean breeze carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. "Yesterday made it clear that your family's respect is conditional on perceived status. James nodded slowly, his expression troubled. I knew they could be status conscious, but watching them transform after your father arrived. He shook his head. It was like watching actors break character. I've never seen that side of them so nakedly displayed. The breakfast we'd ordered sat mostly untouched between us. This wasn't the conversation either of us had imagined having on our first morning as husband and wife. But ignoring what had happened would only allow the underlying issue to fester. The thing is, James continued, they've always been fixated on the right connections and appropriate backgrounds. I just didn't realize how deeply it ran, or how quickly they'd written you off based on assumptions. That's exactly the problem, I said. Their behavior was revealing, both before and after the helicopter. Neither version was about who I actually am. Our honeymoon in the Maldives was scheduled to begin the following day, 2 weeks of isolation, on a private island where we could focus solely on each other. But first, we had the post-wedding brunch to navigate, another Blackwell tradition, hosted at Richard and Margaret's Beacon Hill home for close family and select friends. We could skip it, James suggested, though we both knew that wasn't really an option. Avoiding the situation would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. The Blackwell mansion was exactly what you'd expect, a historic brownstone with meticulously maintained period details outside and impeccably designed modern luxury within. As we arrived, I noticed several guests from the wedding glancing at us with newly curious eyes. News of my father's dramatic entrance had clearly spread. "Olivia, darling?" Margaret Blackwell swept toward us in the foyer, embracing me with unprecedented warmth. "We're absolutely thrilled you could join us this morning. Your parents?" "They had to return to California," I said. "An important project deadline." Her smile faltered momentarily. "What a shame. We were hoping to discuss some potential collaborations with your father. Richard has several contacts in the aviation industry who would be fascinated by his work." And there it was, the first attempt to leverage my family connections, not even 24 hours after discovering them. I kept my expression pleasant, but neutral. "I'm sure my father would be happy to have his office arrange a meeting when his schedule permits." Margaret looked momentarily confused by my redirection, clearly having expected me to eagerly facilitate access. Before she could respond, Richard appeared with James's brother, Thomas. "There she is, our newest Blackwell." Richard's greeting was effusive, a dramatic departure from his previously reserved demeanor toward me. "Thomas was just saying he'd love to pick your brain about sustainable technology investments. Your background gives you unique insights, I'm sure." Thomas, who had barely spoken 10 words to me during the entire engagement, now looked at me with calculating interest. "Absolutely. With your connections in both tech and environmental sectors, you must have perspective on emerging opportunities." I met his gaze steadily. "My insights come from my work, Thomas, not family connections. I'd be happy to discuss what I'm seeing in the sustainability sector based on my professional experience." A subtle shift occurred in the room, a momentary silence as the Blackwells processed my gentle but clear refusal to be their conduit to my parents' wealth and network. James placed his hand at the small of my back, a silent gesture of support. "Of course, your professional expertise is precisely what I meant," Thomas recovered smoothly, though his eyes told a different story. Throughout the brunch, similar interactions played out with various family members. James's cousin Charlotte suddenly remembered we had attended the same environmental conference 2 years earlier, though she had deliberately avoided introduction. Then, his Aunt Patricia mentioned she sat on a non-profit board looking for new members with fresh perspectives, a position she had never thought to mention during our previous meetings. Each time I responded with polite interest but clear boundaries, refusing to inflate my importance or promise access to my parents. Each time, I could feel the calculus behind their eyes, reassessing my value based on what I could or would deliver to their ambitions. By the time we made our exit, The tension was palpable beneath the polite veneer of social niceties. In the car, James gripped the steering wheel tightly. I've never been so embarrassed by my family. It's like they think they've discovered an untapped resource to exploit. That's exactly what they think, I said quietly. The question is what we do about it. The 14-hour flight to the Maldives the next day gave us much-needed distance and time to discuss our situation honestly. Somewhere over the Indian Ocean, with the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers sleeping, James and I mapped out our path forward. I don't want to cut ties with my family, James admitted. Despite everything, they're still my parents, my brother, my extended family. But I also won't let them treat us, as means to an end. I would never ask you to sever your family relationships, I assured him. But we need to establish clear parameters for our interactions with them. We need to be united in our response to their attempts to leverage our relationship. We developed what we came to call our authenticity framework, a set of principles to guide our interactions with the Blackwells moving forward. 1. We would engage based on genuine personal connection, not business opportunity. We would maintain privacy about my family's business unless sharing information served a meaningful purpose. 3. We would redirect conversations that veered into networking territory unless we had independently chosen to make an introduction. 4. We would acknowledge positive behaviors and respectfully address problematic ones directly, rather than letting resentment build. 5. Most importantly, we would regularly check in with each other to ensure we remained aligned in our approach. Our honeymoon provided a blissful respite from family dynamics. For 2 weeks, we were simply James and Olivia, two people building a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. The white sand beaches and crystal waters created a physical paradise, but the true luxury was the emotional space to strengthen our bond away from external pressures and expectations. When we returned to Boston, tanned and renewed, reality waited, for us in the form of a dinner invitation from the Blackwells. To welcome you properly to the family, the elegantly penned note from Margaret read. The subtext was clear. Now that they understood my true value, they were eager to integrate me into their world. We knew this was coming, James said as we discussed whether to accept. This is our first test. The evening of the dinner, we arrived at the Blackwell home to find an intimate gathering of family members and two couples we hadn't met before. After introductions, I realized these new faces belonged to the CEOs of companies that would be valuable partners to my parents' aerospace firm. Margaret mentioned your father's innovative work in lightweight materials, said Edward Forrester, CEO of a major defense contractor, cornering me by the drink cart. We've been exploring similar applications. I'd love to arrange a meeting while I'm in San Francisco next month. I smiled politely. That sounds like something you should discuss directly with Celestial's business development team. I'd be happy to provide the appropriate contact information. Edward looked momentarily confused. I assumed you'd be able to facilitate a more personal introduction. I don't work for my parents' company, I explained simply. I respect their business boundaries, as I hope they respect mine. Across the room, I caught Margaret watching our interaction, her expression shifting from anticipation to disappointment, as she realized I wasn't going to play the role she'd envisioned. Throughout dinner, similar scenarios unfolded. Each time, I maintained friendly professionalism while gently but firmly establishing that I was not a conduit to my parents' business or connections. James supported my positions seamlessly, changing subjects when conversations became too pointed, and reinforcing my redirections with his own. By dessert, the atmosphere had chilled noticeably. As coffee was served in the drawing room, Richard Blackwell finally addressed the elephant in the room. Olivia, he began, his tone carefully modulated. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. When families of our caliber joined together, there's a natural expectation of mutual benefit. The connections, the introductions, the shared opportunities, that's how dynasties are built. The room fell silent. Even the guests seemed uncomfortable with such direct acknowledgement of the evening's true purpose. I understand your perspective, Richard, I replied, keeping my voice steady and respectful. But James and I have a different vision for our marriage. We value family relationships for their emotional connection, not their business potential. We're building a partnership, not a merger. Margaret set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. That sounds lovely in theory, dear, but in practice, families like ours function as unified entities. Your reluctance to facilitate these introductions feels uncooperative. James leaned forward. Mother, we're not being uncooperative. We're establishing healthy boundaries. Olivia isn't refusing appropriate business connections. She's declining to use our marriage as a networking tool. Thomas snorted. Come on, James. Don't be naive. Marriage has always been about alliance building. Why do you think the Blackwells have maintained their position for 3 generations? Strategic. Relationships matter. Relationships built on mutual respect and genuine connection matter, I corrected gently. Those can certainly include business relationships, but they shouldn't begin with calculation. Richard's expression hardened. I think you misunderstand your position, Olivia. You've joined our family. We have certain expectations. Dad, James interrupted, his voice firm but not confrontational. Olivia hasn't joined our family as an acquisition. We've created our own family that connects to both of yours. There's a difference. The tension in the room was palpable. I reached for James's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence beside me. We had anticipated this confrontation, but experiencing it directly was still challenging. I value family deeply, I said, addressing everyone at the table. My parents taught me that true family supports each other's authentic paths rather than attempting to redirect them toward predetermined expectations. I hope we can build relationships based on knowing and respecting each other as individuals, not as assets. As we drove home later that night, the weight of the evening hung between us. We had stood our ground, maintained our boundaries, and clearly articulated our values. But at what cost to James's family relationships? They'll adjust, James said, seeming to read my thoughts. They might not like it initially, but they'll come to respect our position if we remain consistent. And if they don't? I asked softly. Then we'll have learned something valuable about the conditional nature of their acceptance, he replied. Either way, we stay true to ourselves. As the city lights illuminated his profile, I realized we were facing our first major challenge, not just as newlyweds, but as partners in a life philosophy that prioritized authenticity over expedience. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but we were walking it together, clear-eyed and united. The weeks following our confrontation with the Blackwells were deceptively quiet. James returned to his role at Blackwell Development, focusing on the sustainable housing initiative he'd been championing before our wedding. I immersed myself in growing Green Meridian, which had secured 2 major new clients during our honeymoon. On the surface, we were simply a newlywed couple establishing our routine and shared life. Beneath that normality, however, lay the unresolved tension with James's family. They're regrouping, James observed one evening as we prepared dinner in our Cambridge apartment. Dad's always been strategic. He won't push directly again until he's found a new angle. I nodded, dicing vegetables for the stir-fry we were making. I'd respect him more if he simply accepted our boundaries and moved forward on genuine terms. That's not how the Blackwells operate, James replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than defensive. Every relationship is evaluated for its utility. It's been that way since my grandfather converted their single hardware store into a real estate company during the post-war building boom. Is that how you see relationships? I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. James paused, considering the question seriously. I was raised in that mindset. Evaluating people based on what they bring to the table was as natural as breathing. He looked at me, his expression softening. Meeting you changed that perspective. You valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with the Blackwell name or what I could provide. It was revelatory. 2 days later, the new angle James had predicted emerged in the form of a surprise visit from Margaret to my downtown office. My assistant, Priya, showed her into my glass-walled conference room with a questioning look that I answered with a reassuring nod. "Margaret, this is unexpected," I said, joining her and closing the door. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, dear," she replied, looking perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "I was downtown for a foundation meeting and thought we might clear the air, woman to woman." I gestured for her to take a seat, intrigued by this new approach. "I appreciate that. Communication is important, especially in families." Margaret smiled, a practiced expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Exactly. Family is precisely what I wanted to discuss." She glanced around my office, taking in the modest but professional space. "You've built something admirable here, Olivia. It's impressive for someone your age." "Thank you," I said, recognizing the compliment as the prelude it was. "I realize our dinner last week didn't go as anyone hoped," she continued. "Richard can be rather direct, and perhaps we approached things too formally." She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Men often lack subtlety in these matters." I suppressed a smile at this attempt to create female solidarity against the supposedly bumbling approaches of our husbands. "What matters did you have in mind?" "Integration," Margaret replied smoothly. "Bringing our families together in a more organic way. I'm hosting a charity gala next month for Boston Children's Hospital. I sit on their board, and I'd love for your parents to attend as our guests. No business discussions, just social connection, building bridges." I recognized the strategy immediately. A charity event was the perfect setting, public, philanthropic, and difficult to decline without appearing uncharitable. If my parents attended, they would be introduced to dozens of Boston elite under circumstances where business conversations could emerge naturally, rather than through obvious orchestration. "That's thoughtful of you," I said carefully. "But my parents are rarely on the East Coast. Their schedules are extremely demanding." Margaret waved this away. "Of course, but for a cause like children's health care, surely they could make an exception. We could arrange their accommodation at the Four Seasons, send the company jet." She paused, realizing her error. "Though I suppose your father prefers his own transportation." The reference to my father's helicopter was deliberate, reminding me that they now understood my family's financial standing. I maintained my composure, deciding on direct honesty. "Margaret, I appreciate the invitation, but I need to be clear. My parents make their own decisions about their commitments, just as I make mine. I don't manage their social calendar or influence their business relationships." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "But surely, as their daughter, I interrupted gently. I respect their autonomy and expect others to do the same." Margaret studied me for a long moment, reassessing. "You're very protective of your boundaries, Olivia. I'm simply trying to welcome your family properly into ours." "Are you?" I asked, keeping my tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. "Because it feels like you're seeking access rather than connection." The directness of my response caught her off guard. For a brief moment, her carefully maintained facade faltered, revealing the calculating strategist beneath. Then, with impressive speed, she recovered. "I can see why James is drawn to you," she said, her tone shifting to one of reluctant admiration. "You're quite perceptive. Perhaps we can meet in the middle. Rather than inviting your parents, Would you and James consider co-chairing the Young Patrons Committee? It would introduce you to important people in Boston society without any presumptions about your family connections. It was a clever pivot, acknowledging my boundary while still pursuing her goal of socially positioning James and me within her carefully cultivated network. I considered the proposal objectively, separating it from the manipulative context. That's something I'd need to discuss with James, I replied. We make these decisions together, and I'd want to know more about the actual cause and our responsibilities before committing. Margaret nodded, apparently satisfied with this potential opening. Of course, I'll have my assistant send over the details. It's a wonderful opportunity to establish yourselves as a couple in Boston's philanthropic community. After she left, I called James at his office. Your mother just left mine, I began. We need to talk about the Children's Hospital Gala. That evening, James and I dissected Margaret's strategy over takeout Thai food in our living room. It's classic Mom, James said, unsurprised. She's creating a situation where refusing makes us look bad, while accepting puts us on her playing field. The thing is, I said thoughtfully, supporting children's health care is actually aligned with our values. Under different circumstances, this might be something we'd want to do. James nodded, considering. The cause isn't the problem, it's the context and intention behind the invitation. We discussed our options, weighing the pros and cons of each potential response. Refusing outright would further strain relationships and might seem petty. Accepting without conditions would signal that manipulation worked. We needed a third path. What if we counteroffered? I suggested. We accept the committee position but on our terms. We involve ourselves genuinely with the cause, but maintain our boundaries around family connections. Define involvement on our own terms, James mused. It could work. Mom's not used to negotiating these things. She's used to people either falling in line or being excluded. Our decision made, we crafted a careful response to Margaret's formal invitation when it arrived the next day. We would accept positions on the Young Patrons Committee with specific parameters. We would contribute our professional expertise rather than financial connections. We would set clear time boundaries given our other commitments, and we would engage based on the merits of the cause itself. Margaret's response was tellingly brief. Wonderful news. Welcome aboard. We'll make it work. The following weeks revealed the complexity of our chosen path. Committee meetings introduced us to a cross-section of Boston's elite young professionals. Some genuinely passionate about children's health care, others clearly there for networking and social positioning. Margaret had strategically placed us on the corporate outreach team, obviously hoping we would leverage my family connections to secure sponsorships. Instead, James and I approached our role with authentic but bounded commitment. We developed an innovative sponsorship structure that focused on meaningful partnerships rather than transactional donations. We emphasized impact measurement and corporate social responsibility rather than social prestige. Our approach disrupted the usual patterns of Boston philanthropy, which typically involved the same companies donating to the same causes through the same social networks, and created some friction with traditional committee members. The Halston Group has always sponsored the champagne reception, complained Eliza Whitney, a third-generation Boston socialite, during one particularly tense meeting. Your new tiered system disrupts established relationships. The tiered partnership approach actually gives Halston more visibility while creating opportunities for smaller companies to participate meaningfully, I explained. It's more inclusive and potentially more profitable for the hospital. Olivia's right, added Desmond Clark, a committee member who worked in healthcare venture capital. We've been doing this the same way for decades. Maybe it's time for fresh thinking. The committee gradually divided into two camps, those who embraced our impact-focused approach and those who resisted changes to the established social order. Margaret observed these divisions with barely concealed displeasure, especially as hospital administration began enthusiastically supporting our innovations. 3 weeks before the gala, the event director announced that our new sponsorship structure had increased corporate participation by 40% and projected donations by nearly 60% compared to the previous year. It was a vindication of our approach, but also a public demonstration that the traditional Blackwell way wasn't the only path to success. After that meeting, Margaret cornered us in the parking garage. "You've certainly made an impression," she said, her tone making it unclear whether this was criticism or praise, "though I'm concerned you've alienated some long-time supporters." "The numbers suggest we've gained more than we've potentially lost," James replied calmly. "Isn't the goal to raise as much money as possible for the Children's Hospital?" "Of course, but relationships matter in this community," Margaret countered. "These connections sustain multiple causes over many years." "We're building relationships too," I pointed out, "just with a wider group of partners based on shared values rather than social obligation." Margaret studied me with newfound calculation. "You truly believe in this approach, don't you? It's not just about opposing our traditions. I believe in authentic engagement," I replied honestly. "When people connect to causes because they genuinely care, not because they feel socially obligated, their commitment runs deeper and lasts longer." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not agreement exactly, but a reluctant recognition. "You're changing the rules of a game that's worked for generations." "We're not playing a game," James said quietly. "That's the fundamental difference." As we drove home that evening, I couldn't help feeling we'd both succeeded and failed in our first attempt to navigate the Blackwell family dynamics. We'd stayed true to our values and demonstrated an alternative approach that produced tangible results. But we hadn't managed to bridge the philosophical gap with James's family. If anything, we'd highlighted how fundamentally different our worldviews were. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" I asked James as we waited at a red light. He considered the question seriously. "Understanding might be too much to hope for right now, but I think we've given them something they can't ignore or dismiss. Results speak volumes in the Blackwell worldview. So where does that leave us?" "Still navigating," he said, reaching for my hand. "Still finding our way forward together. This was just the first attempt." As the light turned green and we continued toward home, I realized that managing relationships with the Blackwells would be a long-term challenge requiring patience, consistency, and unwavering commitment to our shared values. We had taken our first steps, but the journey was just beginning. The Children's Hospital Gala arrived on a crisp October evening, transforming the Boston Museum of Fine Arts into a glittering showcase of philanthropy and influence. James and I entered the grand marble hall arm in arm, both of us keenly aware that tonight represented more than just a charity event. It was our first major public appearance as a married couple within Boston's elite circles since establishing our boundaries with the Blackwells. "Ready?" James whispered as we handed our coats to the attendant. "As I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing the emerald silk of my gown, a piece designed by an up-and-coming Chinese-American designer, rather than the European luxury brands favored by the Blackwell women. Margaret spotted us immediately, breaking away from a conversation with the hospital's chief of pediatric surgery to intercept our path. "James, Olivia, perfect timing. The Harringtons were just asking about you." Her smile was practiced, her eyes evaluative as she took in my attire. "Dr. Harrington's foundation might be interested in your environmental education initiative, James." The introduction was deliberate, focused on James's project rather than attempting to leverage my family connections. A small adjustment, but a noticeable one. Perhaps our consistent boundaries were beginning to register. As Margaret led us toward the Harringtons, a tall woman with striking silver hair cut a path directly toward us, her determined stride causing even Margaret to pause. "Olivia Chen, I thought that was you." The woman extended her hand with confident warmth. "Dominique Voss. We met briefly at the Copenhagen Sustainability Summit last year. Your presentation on corporate governance metrics was precisely what my foundation had been looking for. I connected the dots immediately. Dominique Voss headed the Voss Foundation, one of the largest environmental funders in New England. We had indeed met briefly in Copenhagen, but I hadn't expected her to remember me among hundreds of presenters. Dr. Voss, it's wonderful to see you again, I replied, genuinely pleased. This is my husband, James Blackwell, and his mother, Margaret Blackwell. Dominique acknowledged them politely, but quickly returned her focus to me. I've been following Green Meridian's work since Copenhagen. Your recent case study on the Providence renovation project was particularly impressive. The energy efficiency outcomes exceeded industry standards while remaining commercially viable. Margaret's expression flickered with surprise, both at Dominique's obvious respect for my work and at the reference to a Blackwell development project she'd likely considered James's achievement alone. The Providence project benefited enormously from James's vision, I said, drawing him into the conversation. His commitment to sustainability within a traditional development company hasn't always been easy. Dominique turned her appraising gaze to James. Breaking new ground within established institutions often creates more substantial change than working only with the already converted. That takes both courage and strategic thinking. Before James could respond, an elegant black woman in a structural midnight blue gown joined our circle. Monopolizing the most interesting people already, Dom? She teased, her British accent refined but warm. Some things never change. Elena Hughes, meet Olivia Chen and James Blackwell, Dominique said. Elena runs Hughes Capital, the investment firm that's been making waves with their climate-focused portfolio. Elena's handshake was firm, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. Green Meridian Consulting, correct? Your firm's reputation for uncompromising standards precedes you. And James, your sustainable housing initiative caught our attention recently. We've been looking for development partners who understand that environmental responsibility and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. I felt Margaret stiffen beside us, recognizing that the conversation had naturally opened doors to exactly the kind of business relationships she had been trying to orchestrate, but through our professional reputations rather than social maneuvering. If you'll excuse me, Margaret said with practiced grace, I should check on the auction arrangements. James, Olivia, I'm sure the Harringtons would love to speak with you later. Her retreat was strategic, a recognition that the dynamics had shifted beyond her control. As the evening progressed, Dominique and Elena introduced us to their circle, a diverse group of professionals unified not by social pedigree, but by innovative approaches to long-standing problems. There was Dr. Sanjay Gupta, a physician-turned-tech entrepreneur who had developed a breakthrough telemedicine platform for underserved communities, Rebecca Okafor, whose urban agriculture company was transforming food deserts in major cities, and Michael Torres, a former Wall Street executive who now headed a major foundation focused on economic mobility. This group differed markedly from the Blackwell's traditional social circle. They discussed impact metrics rather than social affiliations, debated policy approaches instead of country club renovations, and evaluated people based on ideas rather than lineage. Most notably, they engaged with James and me as professionals with valuable perspectives, not as potential conduits to other connections. During dinner, I found myself seated between Elena and Michael, with James across from me beside Dominique and Sanjay. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from climate innovation to healthcare accessibility to the changing nature of philanthropy. Traditional charity models are becoming obsolete, Michael commented, gesturing toward the ornate gala surroundings. Events like this serve their purpose, but the real work happens when we move beyond writing checks to creating systemic solutions. Exactly, Elena agreed, which is why investment approaches need to evolve as well. My firm evaluates not just financial returns, but regenerative impact, how investments create multiple forms of capital, financial, social, environmental. I felt an immediate resonance with their perspectives. That's the framework we use at Green Meridian. Sustainability isn't just about minimizing harm, but about designing systems that become progressively more beneficial over time. This is refreshing, James said, looking around the table. Most conversations in Boston development circles still treat sustainability as a marketing feature, rather than a fundamental approach. Sanjay nodded empathetically. I faced similar resistance in healthcare. The established players see innovation as threatening rather than necessary. It takes finding your tribe to maintain momentum through the resistance. Your tribe, I repeated, struck by the phrase. That's exactly what it feels like tonight. After dinner, as the auction began, Dominique drew me aside. I'll be direct, Olivia. The Voss Foundation is launching a new initiative focused on corporate governance transitions towards sustainability. We need advisors who understand both rigorous environmental standards and the practical realities of implementation. Would Green Meridian be interested in consulting on the framework? The opportunity was significant, exactly the kind of impact-focused work I had built my firm to pursue. We'd absolutely be interested. Perhaps we could discuss the specifics next week. Perfectly professional, Dominique approved with a smile. I've also mentioned your work to several colleagues on the East Coast who've been looking for sustainability. Consultants with actual standards. You should expect some calls. Across the room, I noticed Margaret observing our conversation, her expression unreadable. When Dominique departed to make her auction bids, Margaret approached. You've made quite an impression on Dominique, she said, her tone carefully neutral. She rarely engages so directly with new acquaintances. We share professional interests. I replied simply. Margaret nodded slowly. I see that now. I had assumed. She paused, recalibrating. James mentioned your firm's expertise, of course, but I hadn't fully appreciated your independent professional standing. It was as close to an acknowledgement of her misconceptions as I was likely to get. My work is central to who I am, I said, just as James's vision for sustainable development is central to who he is. Yes, well. Margaret glanced toward where James was engaged in animated conversation with Elena and several other investors. He seems to have found his audience tonight. Later, as the event wound down, Elena pressed business cards into both our hands. Monday morning, my office, 10 a.m., she said decisively. James, I want to hear more about your sustainable housing concepts. Olivia, I have several portfolio companies that could benefit from your governance frameworks. Don't worry about the formalities. We'll figure out the contracting details later. As we drove home, the car filled with a sense of unexpected possibility. James turned to me with wonder in his eyes. That was not what I expected from one of my mother's charity events. We found our people, I said, echoing Sanjay's words. Our tribe. More than that, James replied thoughtfully. We found allies who value us for exactly the reasons the Blackwells don't understand. Our commitment to creating change within established systems. Our refusal to separate ethics from business decisions. The following Monday became Tuesday, then Wednesday, as meetings with Dominique, Elena, and their connections expanded into concrete opportunities. By the end of the week, Green Meridian had signed consulting contracts with the Voss Foundation and two of Elena's portfolio companies. James had secured potential investment for his sustainable housing initiative, independent of Blackwell Development's resources, creating leverage for his vision within the family company. Meanwhile, the Blackwells maintained an uncharacteristic distance. The usual dinner invitations and family obligations were mysteriously postponed or canceled. Through family friends, we heard rumors of intense discussions between Richard, Margaret, and the Blackwell Development Board about modernization strategies and next-generation leadership, corporate euphemisms for the power struggle our new alliances had indirectly triggered. They're reassessing, James observed as we reviewed architectural plans for his housing prototype in our home office. Dad and the old guard can't decide if our new connections are a threat or an opportunity. And Margaret? I asked, curious, about my mother-in-law's perspective after witnessing our interactions at the gala. Mom's more pragmatic than Dad. She recognized something at the gala, that you have professional standing independent of your family connections. It's making her reconsider her approach. 3 weeks after the gala, an unexpected text from Margaret. Requested a private lunch, just the two of us. I accepted with cautious curiosity. We met at a small French bistro far from the Blackwells' usual dining establishments, neutral territory that suggested a deliberate step away from family dynamics. Thank you for meeting me, Margaret began once we had ordered. Her usual composure seemed slightly shaken, her approach less certain than I had ever witnessed. I've been doing some reflection since the gala. Oh? I kept my response neutral, giving her space to continue. I observed something that evening that challenged certain assumptions I've been operating under, she said carefully. The way Dominique Voss and Elena Hughes engaged with you, with both of you, was based entirely on your work, your ideas, your professional reputations. I nodded, waiting as she gathered her thoughts. The Blackwell approach has always been relationship-driven, she continued. We cultivate the right connections, maintain the right affiliations, position ourselves within the right circles. It's how Richard built the company, how his father built it before him. There's value in relationships, I acknowledged, but perhaps in their authenticity rather than their utility. Margaret's eyes met mine directly. The relationships you and James formed that evening, they've already produced tangible outcomes. Elena's investment in James's initiative, your contracts with the Voss Foundation, without any of the maneuvering I would have considered essential. It was the closest thing to admission I had heard from any Blackwell that their approach might have limitations. I responded carefully, recognizing the significance of the moment. Different times require different strategies, I offered. The connections that built Blackwell Development 70 years ago may not be the same ones that will sustain it for the next 70. Margaret studied me thoughtfully. You're diplomatic. I suspect that's not always been easy with our family. A small smile escaped before I could contain it. Let's just say it's been a learning experience for everyone. Indeed. Margaret straightened her silverware, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from her before. I'd like to propose something, a reset of sorts, not dismissing our differences, but perhaps finding a way forward that respects them. I'm listening, I said, genuinely intrigued by this unexpected opening. I've arranged a small dinner next week. Just family. Richard, myself, Thomas and his wife, you and James. No business associates, no agenda beyond reconnection. She hesitated. On your terms, no expectations regarding your parents or connections, simply family. The offer seemed sincere, a genuine attempt to create space for relationship beyond utility. Whether it would translate to meaningful change remained to be seen, but the effort itself represented movement in a positive direction. I think we'd both appreciate that, I said. A fresh start focused on knowing each other as people first. As we finished our lunch with conversation that carefully avoided both business and family tensions, I realized we had gained something unexpected through our principled stand. Not just professional allies who valued our work, but the beginning of a shift within the Blackwell family itself. The change might be tentative and incomplete, but it was real. Evidence that maintaining boundaries with integrity could sometimes transform relationships rather than sever them. That evening, as James and I discussed Margaret's invitation, we recognized that our path forward would still require vigilance and consistency. One lunch and a family dinner wouldn't erase ingrained patterns overnight. But we had discovered something powerful in the process, that by standing firmly in our authentic values, we had attracted not only professional allies, but perhaps begun the long process of genuine family transformation. "It's a start," James said, his expression hopeful but realistic. "A small one, but genuine." "Sometimes that's how real change begins," I replied. "Not with dramatic confrontations, but with quiet reassessments and small steps toward understanding." The promised family dinner at the Blackwell home arrived on a Thursday evening in early November. As James and I approached the familiar brownstone, golden light spilled from the windows onto the leaf-strewn sidewalk. The air held the first real bite of winter, a reminder that seasons change, and perhaps relationships could too. "Different. This time," James noted as we climbed the granite steps. "No extra cars, no strategic guests, just family, as promised." Richard himself opened the door. Unusual, as the housekeeper typically handled greetings. His expression carried a hint of uncertainty that I'd never seen before. "James, Olivia, thank you for coming." The formality in his tone suggested this evening held more significance for him than typical family gatherings. The interior of the Blackwell home seemed different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and ancestral portraits remained as imposing as ever, but the atmosphere felt less rigid. In the living room, Margaret was arranging flowers, not directing staff to do so, but handling the task herself. "I'm trying something new," she explained, catching my surprised glance. "Dominique mentioned at the gala that she finds flower arranging meditative. I thought I'd see if she's right." Thomas and his wife Catherine appeared from the library, both looking slightly ill at ease. Thomas had always been the perfect Blackwell heir, embracing the family's traditional values without James's questioning nature. Catherine, from an established Boston family herself, had seamlessly integrated into Blackwell dynamics. This reset seemed to unsettle their understanding of family protocols. "Drinks before dinner?" Richard offered, moving to the sidebar. "I've opened that Barolo you enjoyed last time, James." The careful consideration of preferences, remembering what wine James favored, struck me as a small but meaningful gesture. Typically, Richard selected wines to impress rather than to please individual tastes. As we settled with our drinks, an awkward silence descended. Without business discussions or social maneuvering to provide structure, the Blackwells seemed unsure how to proceed. James caught my eye, a silent question passing between us. Should we rescue the moment, or let them navigate this unfamiliar territory? I decided to offer a bridge. The gala was remarkably successful. The hospital director mentioned they exceeded their fundraising target by nearly 40%. Margaret nodded, seeming grateful for the opening. "The new sponsorship approach you both championed made a significant difference. Several committee members have suggested implementing similar structures for future events." "Change is difficult but sometimes necessary," I said, the comment holding meaning beyond fundraising strategies. Richard cleared his throat. "Yes, well, speaking of change." He glanced at Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I've been doing some thinking since the gala, about family, about business, about how the two intersect, or perhaps how they shouldn't." The directness of his statement surprised me. Richard Blackwell typically spoke in carefully crafted corporate phrases that preserved plausible deniability. This straightforward acknowledgement represented a departure from his usual approach. "The connections you both formed that evening," he continued, "they occurred naturally through professional respect. No orchestration, no strategic positioning, just genuine recognition of capability and shared values." He swirled his scotch, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. It was illuminating. Thomas shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "Dad, are you suggesting the Blackwell approach to relationship building is flawed? Because the company's success over 3 generations suggests otherwise." "Not flawed," Richard replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps just incomplete, possibly outdated for certain modern contexts." The admission seemed to cost him something, a small crack in the certainty that had defined his leadership. James leaned forward slightly, recognizing the significance of the moment. "In what way, Dad?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Richard's gaze lifted to meet his son's. "Your generation operates differently. The leaders you connect with, people like Elena Hughes and Dominique Voss, they evaluate partnerships based on values alignment and innovation potential, not just traditional markers of success or social position." A hint of reluctant admiration colored his voice. "Their approach is more direct, more authentic, I suppose." "The business landscape is changing," James offered. "Environmental concerns, social impact, governance transparency. These aren't just buzzwords anymore. They're fundamental shifts in how markets operate and how success is measured." Margaret set down her wineglass. "We've been having some important conversations since the gala," she said, glancing at Richard. "About family expectations, about respecting different approaches, about—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "About seeing people for who they are rather than what they represent." Catherine, Thomas's wife, spoke up unexpectedly. "Has something specific prompted this reflection? Beyond the gala, I mean." The question hung in the air for a moment before Margaret responded with uncharacteristic candor. "Watching how Olivia and James navigate their professional worlds with principle rather than calculation has been instructive." She turned to face me directly. "Particularly how you've maintained boundaries while still building bridges, Olivia. It's not an approach I fully understood initially." This acknowledgement, from Margaret especially, represented a profound shift. I measured my response carefully, recognizing the vulnerability beneath her statement. "Boundaries and bridges aren't contradictory," I said. "Clear boundaries actually make authentic connection possible. They define where the bridge begins and ends." "A civil engineering metaphor," Richard noted with unexpected humor, "appropriate for a family of builders." The tension in the room eased slightly, and as we moved to the dining room, conversation flowed more naturally. For the first time since I'd known them, the Blackwells began asking personal rather than strategic questions about my childhood, my parents' immigration journey, my professional passion for environmental sustainability. They listened with genuine interest rather than evaluative calculation. During dessert, Richard tapped his water glass gently. "There's another reason we wanted this dinner tonight," he said, "beyond reconnection." Margaret placed her hand over his on the table, a public display of support unusual for their typically formal dynamic. Richard continued, "The board has been discussing succession planning for Blackwell development. Traditionally, this would be a straightforward matter of Thomas taking the helm as the eldest son, with James continuing to manage specific projects." Thomas straightened, his expression a mixture of pride and apprehension. "However," Richard continued, "recent developments have prompted us to reconsider this approach. The company needs to evolve to remain relevant in changing markets. Thomas excels at maintaining our core business model, while James has demonstrated vision for expansion into new territories, particularly sustainable development." James set down his fork, his attention fully captured. "Dad, what exactly are you suggesting?" "A co-leadership model," Richard replied. "Thomas as CEO focusing on our traditional development sectors, you as president leading our sustainability, initiatives and new market expansions, equal voices, complementary strengths." The proposal hung in the air, radical for a family that had always followed strict hierarchical succession. Thomas's jaw tightened momentarily before he composed himself. "This is unexpected," he said carefully. "But potentially powerful," Catherine added, surprising everyone. "Your strengths have always been different, complementary. Together, you could expand the company in ways neither could alone." As Thomas and James began discussing possibilities, tentatively. At first, then with growing animation, I caught Margaret watching me from across the table. "This isn't what you expected from tonight," she said quietly, moving to sit beside me as the brothers engaged in their discussion. "No," I admitted. "But I appreciate the thought behind it." "It's not just strategic," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Though of course there are business advantages to the arrangement." A ghost of her familiar calculating approach surfaced before disappearing again. "It's also recognition that different doesn't mean wrong, that perhaps there's room for multiple approaches within the Blackwell legacy." "That's a meaningful shift," I acknowledged. Margaret nodded slowly. "The way you've stood your ground while remaining respectful, it's forced us to see you, to really see you, rather than what we assumed you represented." She hesitated. "I won't pretend to have abandoned a lifetime of beliefs overnight, but I am reconsidering certain assumptions." As the evening progressed, I observed the subtle but significant shift in family dynamics. Richard engaged with James's sustainability concepts with genuine interest rather than tolerance. Thomas, after his initial shock, began identifying practical ways his traditional business acumen could support his brother's more innovative approaches. Catherine revealed herself to be more thoughtful and independent than her usual perfect Blackwell wife persona had suggested. On the drive home, James and I processed the unexpected developments. "Co-leadership," he mused, still sounding slightly stunned. "I never thought Dad would consider anything but traditional succession." "It's a meaningful compromise," I said, acknowledging the value of innovation while preserving core strengths. "Do you think it's genuine?" James asked, the question reflecting our lingering skepticism after months of strategic maneuvering. "Or just a new approach to achieving old goals?" I considered carefully before answering. "I think it's both. Your parents are pragmatic. They see the business advantages of evolution. But there's also something more personal happening. They're beginning to recognize that relationships built on authentic connection can be more powerful than those built on calculation. A lesson they learned by watching us maintain our boundaries," James noted with quiet satisfaction. "By watching us succeed while maintaining our boundaries," I corrected gently. "That's the key. Our principles didn't alienate influential connections. They attracted the right ones, people who share our values and vision." As we arrived home, James reached for my hand. "I realized something tonight, watching my family trying so hard to adapt. Maintaining your authenticity isn't just about personal integrity. It's actually the most effective strategy in a world where superficial connections are increasingly insufficient." His observation captured the deeper truth emerging from our experience, that principles consistently applied could become a catalyst for transformation, not just in our own lives, but in the systems and relationships around us. The Blackwells were beginning to understand what James and I had committed to from the start. That genuine connection, built on mutual respect and shared values, created possibilities that strategic maneuvering never could. The evening represented not an end to our challenges, but a deeper understanding of their nature. The path forward would still require vigilance and clarity, but we now recognized that our consistent boundaries hadn't just protected our integrity, they had created the conditions for authentic growth, both personally and professionally. The Blackwells were evolving, however gradually, not because we had compromised our values, but because we had honored them. December arrived with unexpected opportunities. Following the family dinner, James and I found ourselves navigating a transformed landscape, not entirely free of challenges, but fundamentally altered in ways that demanded a new strategy. The proposed co-leadership structure at Blackwell Development had moved from conversation to concrete planning, with lawyers drafting revised company bylaws and the board scheduling special sessions to ratify the new arrangement. Meanwhile, my Work with the Voss Foundation had expanded beyond initial consultancy into a leadership role designing their corporate governance initiative. Green Meridian had hired 3 new sustainability analysts to manage our growing client portfolio, and I was fielding weekly inquiries from companies seeking to integrate environmental responsibility into their core operations rather than treating it as an afterthought. "We need to get strategic," I told James one Sunday morning as we reviewed our increasingly complicated schedules over coffee. Our dining table had disappeared beneath laptops, calendars, and project documents. Both our professional lives are expanding, the Blackwell family dynamics are shifting, and we haven't had a real conversation about our long-term vision as a couple. James nodded, pushing aside a stack of architectural renderings. "You're right. We've been reacting, effectively, but still reacting, rather than deliberately designing our path forward." That conversation initiated what we came to call our integrated life strategy, a comprehensive approach to aligning our professional ambitions, personal values, and family relationships. Rather than addressing these dimensions separately, we recognized their profound interconnection and the need for coherent principles that could guide decisions across all aspects of our lives. Our first step was clarifying our core values, the non-negotiable principles that would serve as our decision-making foundation. After several deep conversations, we identified 5. 1. Authenticity in all relationships, professional and personal. Environmental responsibility as both practice and purpose. 3. Meaningful contribution to causes larger than ourselves. 4. Balance between achievement and well-being. Mutual support of each other's individual growth. With these values established, we assessed our current commitments, responsibilities, and aspirations against them. This process revealed both alignments and disconnects. James's sustainability initiatives at Blackwell Development strongly aligned with our environmental values, but created tension with our well-being principle due to the political navigation required. My expanding consultancy work embodied meaningful contribution but threatened balance as client demands intensified. "The question isn't whether to pursue these opportunities," James observed as we mapped everything visually on our living room wall, "but how to approach them in ways that honor all our values simultaneously." This insight led to the most innovative aspect of our strategy: integrated boundaries. Rather than setting separate professional and personal boundaries, we developed principles that addressed whole life integrity. These weren't rules about what we wouldn't do, but guidelines for how we would engage across all domains. The following week, I met with Margaret for what had become our regular lunch, a still evolving but increasingly genuine connection. We chose a small cafe near the public garden, its windows frosted with winter patterns. "You seem particularly energized today," Margaret noted as we settled at our table. "New project?" "New approach, actually," I replied. "James and I have been developing a framework for managing our expanding responsibilities while staying true to our core values." Margaret's expression showed genuine interest, a marked change from her former calculated assessment. "That sounds more comprehensive than typical time management." "It is," I acknowledged. "It's about coherence across all dimensions of life, not just efficiency within each separate domain." I shared the outlines of our integrated strategy, watching as Margaret processed the approach. Her analytical mind had always been her most genuine quality, even when applied to social calculations I disagreed with. "This is quite different from how Richard and I approached our family and professional lives," she said thoughtfully. "We always maintained strict compartmentalization, business concerns, social positioning, family matters, all in separate categories with different rules of engagement." "How did that work for you?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than challenging. Margaret considered the question with surprising candor. "Effectively, in terms of building the company and our position in Boston society. less effectively for personal fulfillment or authentic relationships. She met my eyes directly. Richard and I achieved everything we aimed for, but sometimes I wonder if we were aiming at the right targets. This vulnerability, still rare, but increasingly present in our interactions, created space for the next step in our evolving relationship. "I'd value your perspective on something," I said. "James and I are implementing this integrated approach with the Blackwell family relationships as well. We'd like to establish a new pattern of engagement that honors both your family traditions and our personal values." Margaret's expression registered surprise at being consulted rather than informed. "What did you have in mind?" "Regular family dinners without business agendas, for one," I suggested. "Building genuine connections, rather than strategic ones. Being present at important family events while maintaining our other commitments. Supporting the family legacy while being true to our own vision." "And if conflicts arise between those priorities?" Margaret asked, her pragmatic nature emerging. "We address them directly with mutual respect, seeking solutions that honor both perspectives rather than demanding one yield to the other." Margaret was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "You know, Olivia, when you first married James, I saw you primarily as an obstacle to our established plans for his future. Then, after your father's dramatic entrance, I reassessed you as a potential asset to be leveraged." She shook her head slightly. "It never occurred to me to simply see you as a person with your own valid perspective and contribution." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm beginning to understand why James is so drawn to you. Your approach is clarifying. It cuts through the social complications we've built up over generations to focus on what actually matters." She straightened, her posture reflecting a decision reached. "I'd like to try this new pattern. Richard may take more convincing, but I think even he is recognizing the limitations of our traditional approach." This conversation marked a turning point in implementing our integrated strategy. With Margaret cautiously on board, we began extending the same principles to other relationships and commitments. James initiated a similar discussion with Thomas about their developing professional partnership. Rather than accepting the traditional competitive dynamic that had characterized their relationship since childhood, he proposed a complementary approach based on mutual respect for their different strengths. "We've always been cast as rivals," James told his brother during a private lunch at Thomas's club. "You as the traditional heir, me as the idealistic challenger. But what if that framework itself is outdated? What if our differences are actually our greatest asset as a leadership team?" Thomas, initially skeptical, gradually warmed to the concept as James outlined specific ways their contrasting perspectives could strengthen the company. "I still believe in our core business model," Thomas acknowledged. "The traditional development approach has built our family legacy. And it should continue," James agreed. "But alongside new initiatives that address changing market demands and environmental realities, neither approach needs to dominate or eliminate the other." By mid-December, this philosophy of integration rather than competition had begun transforming both our professional projects and family dynamics. At Blackwell Development, James and Thomas were jointly developing a 5-year strategic plan that maintained the company's traditional strengths while establishing leadership in sustainable development. At Green Meridian, I implemented management structures that preserved our rigorous standards while accommodating growth. The approach faced its first significant test when Richard Blackwell invited us to the company's annual Christmas gala, traditionally a high-profile networking event where business relationships were cultivated and strategic alliances reinforced. The old expectation would be for us to work the room, leverage connections, position ourselves within the company hierarchy, James noted as we prepared for the evening. "How do we approach this through our integrated framework?" "Authentically," I replied. "We engage genuinely with people we find interesting or aligned with our values. We're respectful of tradition without being bound by it. We're present without performing. The Blackwell Development Gala transformed the company's downtown headquarters into a winter wonderland, with snow-flocked trees, crystalline decorations, and string musicians playing from a balcony overlooking the main reception area. As James and I entered, I immediately sensed the layered dynamics: corporate politics, social positioning, strategic interactions, all disguised as festive celebration. Richard approached us immediately, champagne flutes in hand. James, Olivia. Perfect timing. The Westbrook Group executives just arrived. They're considering a major development partnership, and I'd like to introduce you both. In the past, this would have been a command rather than a request, and James would have complied automatically. Now he responded with polite directness. We'd be happy to meet them, Dad. Give us a few minutes to greet Mom and Thomas first, and then we'll join you by the east window. Richard blinked, momentarily disconcerted by the modified response, then nodded. Of course. They'll be here all evening. As he walked away, James squeezed my hand. Small steps. Throughout the evening, we implemented our integrated approach in practical ways. We engaged in meaningful conversations rather than strategic small talk. We connected people based on genuine shared interests rather than calculated advantage. We excused ourselves from discussions that contradicted our values, doing so with respect rather than judgment. The effect was subtle, but significant. By midnight, several executives had sought us out for authentic conversations about industry challenges and innovations. Employees from various levels of the company approached James with ideas, sensing his genuine interest transcended hierarchy. Even Richard observed the pattern with a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. You've created quite a different atmosphere in your corner of the gala, he commented as the event wound down. People seem energized after speaking with you. Authentic engagement tends to have that effect, James replied. When people feel genuinely seen and heard, it releases a different kind of energy than strategic networking. Richard considered this, glancing around at the remaining guests. Your mother mentioned you've developed some sort of comprehensive life strategy. Perhaps you could share more about it at our year-end planning retreat. The invitation to contribute philosophical direction rather than just project-specific input represented unprecedented recognition of our approach's value. We'd be happy to, James responded, meeting his father's gaze directly, but with an understanding that we're offering perspective, not promising conformity. Richard nodded slowly. Understood. Different approaches can coexist within the same framework. That seems to be the lesson of recent months. As we drove home through Boston's empty streets, Christmas lights reflecting off fresh snow, I felt a profound sense of progress. Our integrated strategy wasn't eliminating challenges or transforming the Blackwell family overnight, but it was creating space for authentic growth while honoring both tradition and innovation. What are you thinking? James asked, noticing my thoughtful silence. That development isn't always about building new structures, I replied. Sometimes it's about renovating existing ones, honoring their foundation while improving their function and sustainability. James smiled, recognizing the architectural metaphor's application to our family situation. Preservation and innovation in balance. Exactly. The company's called Blackwell Development after all. Maybe it's time for the family itself to develop in new directions while maintaining its core strength. This insight crystallized the essence of our new approach, not rejection of tradition, but evolution of it. Not dismissal of the past, but integration of it into a more sustainable and authentic future. The path forward would still present challenges, but we now had a coherent framework for navigating them, one that honored both where we came from and where we were going. As we arrived home, the quiet significance of our progress settled around us like the gently falling snow. We had moved beyond reactive boundary setting to proactive integration, beyond defending our values to embodying them in ways that created space for others to evolve as well. This wasn't just a strategy for managing family dynamics. It was a philosophy for building a life of integrity across all dimensions. January brought with it not just a new year, but the tangible implementation of our integrated life strategy. As snowdrifts piled against Boston's brownstones and temperatures plummeted, James and I found ourselves navigating both professional expansions and evolving family dynamics with our newly developed framework as our guide. The Blackwell Development Year-End Planning Retreat took place at a historic lodge in the Berkshires, the company's executives and board members gathering for 3 days of strategic discussion. Traditionally, spouses hadn't been included in these sessions, but Richard had specifically requested my presence alongside James for our presentation on our integrated approach. "Nervous?" James asked as we drove through the snow-covered landscape, mountains rising around us. "Thoughtful," I corrected. "This isn't just about impressing your father's executive team. It's about introducing a fundamentally different way of approaching life and business without seeming to criticize their existing methods." The lodge appeared ahead, smoke curling from stone chimneys against the winter sky. Inside, a massive central fireplace warmed the rustic luxe great room where executives and their partners mingled during evening social hours. During the day, however, the business sessions took place in a modern conference facility built discreetly behind the historic structure. Richard greeted us with unexpected warmth when we arrived, introducing me to board members who had previously paid little attention to executives' spouses. "Olivia brings a valuable perspective on integrated governance and sustainability metrics," he explained to the chairman, his tone suggesting this was relevant information rather than social pleasantry. Our presentation was scheduled for the second morning, following discussions of market projections and competitive analysis. As James and I entered the conference room, I noted the skeptical expressions on several older board members' faces. We represented not just new ideas, but a challenge to established power structures and traditional approaches. "I appreciate the opportunity to share our framework," James began once we were introduced. "What Olivia and I have developed isn't just a personal philosophy, but a potential model for organizational coherence in a rapidly changing business environment." For the next 40 minutes, we outlined our integrated approach, not as a rejection of traditional business principles, but as an evolution of them. We presented case studies demonstrating how alignment between values and actions enhanced both performance and sustainability. We showed data from companies that had successfully integrated environmental responsibility into their core business models, rather than treating it as a separate, corporate social responsibility function. "The key insight," I explained, addressing questions about practical implementation, is that fragmentation between personal values and professional actions, between stated principles and operational decisions, creates inefficiency and vulnerability. Integration isn't just ethically sound, it's strategically advantageous. The discussion that followed revealed both resistance and curiosity. Thomas, to my surprise, became one of our strongest advocates during the debate. "I was skeptical. Initially," he admitted to the group. "It sounded idealistic rather than practical. But working with James on our co-leadership structure has demonstrated that integrating different perspectives actually strengthens decision-making and expands opportunities." By the session's end, Richard had commissioned a task force to explore implementing elements of our framework within Blackwell Development's operations, not wholesale adoption, but thoughtful integration of compatible aspects. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was meaningful progress. That evening, as executives and their partners gathered for dinner, Margaret approached me by the fireplace. "You've made quite an impression," she said, her tone suggesting this outcome had surprised her. "Several board members' wives have asked me about your consulting work." "For their husbands' companies?" I asked, curious about her reaction. "No," Margaret replied with a hint of amusement. "For their own initiatives. Apparently, Elizabeth Harrington has been developing a sustainable textiles company, and Victoria West sits on 3 nonprofit boards focused on environmental education. They've operated these interests separately from their husbands' business circles until now. This revelation highlighted exactly the kind of fragmentation our integrated approach sought to address. Women with significant capabilities and concerns maintaining separate spheres, rather than bringing their full perspectives to family enterprises. "Would you be willing to meet with them informally tomorrow?" Margaret asked. "Nothing structured, just coffee during the morning break." "Of course," I agreed, recognizing another opportunity to extend our framework's influence. The coffee gathering the next day expanded from 2 women to 8, ranging from board members' wives to female executives who had been quietly pushing for sustainability initiatives within their departments. The conversation revealed a pattern: significant expertise and passion for environmental and social responsibility existing within the extended Blackwell network, but largely compartmentalized from serious business discussions. "We've always had the Sustainability Committee," explained Rebecca Thornton, VP of Operations, "but it's seen as peripheral, something to mention in the annual report rather than integrate into core strategy." "That's changing," I assured her. "The market itself is demanding integration. Companies that treat sustainability as separate from business strategy are increasingly vulnerable to both regulatory changes and consumer preferences." This informal gathering eventually evolved into a more structured working group that met throughout January and February, developing proposals for integrating sustainability metrics into Blackwell Development's project evaluation framework. What had begun as a philosophical discussion was transforming into practical implementation. Meanwhile, James and Thomas continued refining their co-leadership model, each bringing distinct strengths to the restructuring process. Thomas's meticulous attention to operational details complemented James's visionary approach to new opportunities. Their working relationship, though still occasionally tense, demonstrated the power of integration rather than competition. "It's remarkable," Richard commented during a family dinner in late January. "I've always seen your differences as a management challenge. Now I'm watching them become a strategic advantage." "The key was stopping the comparison," James explained. "Once we recognized we were pursuing different but complementary paths rather than competing for the same position, collaboration became possible." "More than possible," Thomas added. "Actually advantageous. I've been so focused on maintaining our core business model that I missed emerging opportunities." James sees market evolutions I might have dismissed. This transformation in the brothers' professional relationship gradually extended to their personal one as well. Thomas and Catherine invited us to dinner at their home. Not for business discussion, but simply to strengthen family bonds. Catherine, who had always maintained perfect Blackwell wife composure, revealed herself to be a knowledgeable art historian, with particular interest in contemporary Chinese artists. "I've always kept my academic interests separate from family gatherings," she admitted as she showed me her impressive library. "It didn't seem relevant to Blackwell business discussions." "That compartmentalization costs everyone," I observed. "Your perspective enriches the family conversation, whether or not it directly connects to business concerns." By mid-February, our integrated approach had begun showing measurable results across multiple dimensions. Professionally, James and Thomas unveiled their co-developed 5-year strategy to the Blackwell board, receiving unanimous approval for its balance of traditional strength and innovative direction. Green Meridian secured a major contract with a national retail chain seeking to transform their sustainability practices from superficial marketing to substantive operations. On the personal front, family gatherings had evolved from strategic networking opportunities to genuine connections. Sunday dinners at the Blackwell home now included discussions ranging from business developments to art exhibitions to social concerns, with all perspectives valued for their contribution rather than their utility. The most significant progress, however, came in early March when Margaret called to discuss the family's annual summer gathering at their Cape Cod compound. "We're considering some changes this year," she explained. "Traditionally, the retreat has been primarily for Blackwell development strategy sessions, with social activities as secondary considerations. Richard and I have been discussing a different approach, one that places family connection at the center, with business discussions as an important but not dominant element." Her description aligned precisely with our integrated framework, not eliminating business considerations, but recontextualizing them within a more holistic understanding of family purpose and values. "That sounds meaningful," I responded. "What prompted the reconsideration?" Margaret was quiet for a moment before answering with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Watching you and James these past months, how you've integrated your values across all aspects of your lives without compartmentalizing, it's made Richard and me reflect on what we've sacrificed for success as we defined it." She continued, thoughtfully, "We achieved everything we aimed for professionally, but the cost was a certain authenticity in our relationships. Friends chosen for strategic advantage rather than genuine connection. Family interactions structured around business concerns rather than personal ones." "It's never too late to realign," I offered, moved by her candor. "That's precisely what we're attempting," she agreed. "Starting with this summer's gathering, we'd like your input on restructuring it to better balance tradition with more meaningful connection." This invitation to help reshape a cornerstone Blackwell tradition represented remarkable progress from our wedding day, when I had been seen first as an unwelcome outsider, then as a potential asset to be leveraged. Now my perspective was being sought for its inherent value, a transformation that validated our consistent commitment to authentic engagement. The following week, James and I met with Richard and Margaret to discuss the summer retreat redesign. The conversation revealed how significantly perceptions had shifted in both directions. I had initially viewed the Blackwells primarily through the lens of their calculating approach to relationships. Now I recognized the genuine care beneath, their focus on family legacy and security. They had initially seen me through the distorting lens of assumption and utility. Now they engaged with my actual perspectives and contributions. "The challenge," Richard acknowledged as we reviewed potential approaches, "is honoring tradition while creating space for authentic connection. Some family members and longtime executives will resist any change to established patterns." "Integration rather than elimination," James suggested, echoing a core principle of our framework. "Maintain elements that hold meaning and value while evolving those that don't serve the deeper purpose." "The summer retreat has always been about securing the Blackwell legacy," Margaret noted. "We're not changing that purpose, just recognizing that legacy encompasses more than business continuity. It includes family relationships, shared values, meaningful traditions." By the end of our planning session, we had developed a restructured retreat that maintained key business elements, while expanding space for genuine family connection and individual expression. The revised approach reflected a more integrated understanding of success, one that valued financial prosperity alongside relational health and personal fulfillment. As James and I drove home that evening, Boston's skyline glittering against the night sky, I felt a profound sense of validation. Our approach wasn't just working, it was catalyzing transformation beyond our immediate circumstances to influence family systems and business operations that had remained unchanged for generations. "I never expected your parents to embrace these changes so substantively," I admitted. "I thought we'd achieve respectful boundaries at best, not active engagement with a different philosophy." "People respond to demonstrated value," James observed. "We didn't just talk about integration, we lived it consistently and let the results speak for themselves." This insight captured the essence of our progress. Principles embodied rather than merely articulated, values demonstrated through consistent action rather than periodic declarations. The changes around us weren't happening because we had demanded them, but because we had steadfastly modeled an alternative that produced visible benefits across all dimensions of life. The path ahead would undoubtedly hold further challenges and adjustments. Integration wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process requiring continuous attention and refinement. Yet the initial progress was undeniable, both in tangible outcomes and in the shifted attitudes that promised sustainable change. As winter began yielding to early spring, with crocuses pushing through melting snow along Commonwealth Avenue, I recognized that we had moved beyond mere implementation to genuine momentum. Our integrated approach had taken root and begun branching into multiple dimensions of our lives, creating not just balance, but a sense of coherent purpose across professional achievement, family relationships, and personal fulfillment. The arrival of April brought unexpected challenges that tested the durability of our integrated approach. What had seemed like steady progress suddenly faced significant opposition, revealing that meaningful change rarely advances without resistance. The catalyst came from outside the immediate Blackwell circle, but quickly rippled through both professional and family systems. Hamilton Reed, a longtime Blackwell Development Board member and close friend of Richard's, had observed the evolving dynamics with growing concern. A traditionalist who had helped build the company's regional dominance through conventional development approaches, Reed viewed the sustainability initiatives and leadership restructuring as threats to a successful model. During the April board meeting, he launched a coordinated challenge. "The quarterly numbers speak for themselves," Reed announced, distributing analysis documents that hadn't been included in the pre-meeting materials. While our competitors have maintained focus on core market segments, Blackwell Development has diverted significant resources to unproven sustainability initiatives with longer ROI timelines and uncertain market demand. The room tensed as Reed continued his critique, methodically questioning the co-leadership model, the integrated governance approach, and particularly the influence of outside perspectives, a thinly veiled reference to my role in shaping James's thinking. His presentation culminated in a formal motion to reevaluate the recently approved 5-year strategy and return to the company's proven approaches. Thomas surprised everyone with his immediate and firm response. "These numbers present an intentionally narrow analysis that ignores significant factors," he stated, standing to address the board. "The diverted resources Mr. Reed references have already secured 3 major municipal contracts specifically because of our sustainable development expertise. Contracts our competitors couldn't access." James joined his brother, presenting complementary data that demonstrated how their integrated approach was opening new market segments while strengthening the company's position in established ones. Their unified defense, the traditional heir and the innovative challenger standing together, carried significant weight with the board. Reed, however, had prepared for this possibility. "The personal dynamics at play cannot be ignored," he continued smoothly. "While I respect the Blackwell brothers individually, we must acknowledge that recent changes in family relationships have accelerated shifts in business strategy that may not serve shareholder interests. When personal considerations influence business decisions, objectivity suffers." His implication was clear. The improved relationship between James and Thomas, along with my influence as James's wife, had compromised sound business judgment. By framing professional decisions as emotionally motivated, Reed attempted to undermine their credibility regardless of the supporting data. The board meeting ended without resolving the challenge, with Richard calling for a special session the following week to continue the discussion. As we left the Blackwell Development offices, the tension was palpable. This wasn't merely a strategic disagreement, but a fundamental challenge to the integrated approach we had been building. "Reed's not acting alone," Thomas observed as we gathered in Richard's office immediately afterward. "He's coordinating with Jensen, Whitfield, and Lowell, all longtime board members who've been quietly concerned about the company's direction. Nearly 40% of voting shares between them," Richard confirmed grimly. "Not enough to force changes without additional support, but sufficient to create significant disruption if they persist." James maintained composed determination. Their core concern isn't really about quarterly performance. It's about control and a narrow definition of how business should operate. Reed represents the old guard that believes business decisions should be purely transactional, stripped of values, considerations, or broader impact assessments. Precisely what our integrated approach challenges, I noted. The following days brought escalating pressure. Reed's faction began reaching out to other shareholders, raising concerns about ideological rather than market-driven decision-making. They arranged meetings with key clients, suggesting that Blackwell Development's new direction might affect project delivery or cost structures. Most distressingly, they attempted to create division within the family itself. Margaret received calls from several longtime social connections questioning the wisdom of the co-leadership arrangement and expressing concern about the company's stability. Thomas's wife, Catherine, reported similar conversations at her charity committee meetings, where Reed's wife had pointedly mentioned the risks of experimental management structures in family businesses. The coordinated nature of these efforts revealed deliberate strategy rather than spontaneous reaction. Reed's faction was attacking the integrated approach on multiple fronts, questioning its business logic, challenging its governance structure, and attempting to destabilize its family foundation. The crisis point came during Sunday dinner at the Blackwell home, when Richard raised the possibility of strategic compromise. "Perhaps we've moved too quickly," he suggested, his expression troubled. Reed's faction makes some valid points about pace of change and risk exposure. A modified approach might address their concerns while preserving essential elements of the new direction. "What kind of modification?" James asked carefully. "Maintaining the sustainability initiatives, but within a more traditional governance structure," Richard replied. "Perhaps returning to clear hierarchical leadership while continuing the environmental focus." The suggestion highlighted how effectively Reed had framed the issue, positioning our integrated approach as radical and risky while presenting traditional hierarchy as prudent and proven. Even Richard, who had witnessed the benefits of our approach, was considering retreat in the face of organized opposition. "Before we discuss compromise," I said, choosing my words deliberately, "we should be clear about what we'd be compromising. This isn't just about leadership structure or sustainability metrics. It's about cohesion versus fragmentation." I paused, ensuring I had everyone's attention before continuing. "The traditional approach that Reed advocates maintains artificial separations between business and values, between professional roles and personal perspectives, between short-term returns and long-term impacts. Our integrated approach recognizes that these dimensions are inherently connected, whether we acknowledge the connections or not." "That's precisely what concerns Reed's faction," Richard countered. "They believe business functions best when it remains focused on its primary purpose, creating shareholder value, without complications from broader considerations." "But that's fundamentally flawed thinking," Thomas interjected, surprising me with his vehemence. "The purpose of business isn't isolated from the purpose of human activity generally. Creating shareholder value is meaningless if it undermines the systems that shareholders depend on for everything else they value." His philosophical stance, quite different from the pragmatic, traditions-focused Thomas Y had first met, demonstrated how significantly his thinking had evolved through engaging with our integrated framework. James built on his brother's point. Reed's presenting a false choice between business performance and integrated values. Our results demonstrate that alignment between values and operations enhances performance rather than compromising it. As the family discussion continued into the evening, a critical insight emerged. Reed's challenge, though framed in business terms, was fundamentally philosophical. He wasn't merely questioning specific decisions, but challenging the legitimacy of an approach that integrated dimensions he believed should remain separate. This clarity helped us recognize that effective response required addressing not just the specific criticisms, but the underlying worldview they represented. By the evening's end, we had developed a comprehensive strategy that maintained our integrated approach while directly addressing the concerns Reed had raised. The special board meeting the following week became the forum for implementing this strategy. Rather than defensively responding to Reed's critique, James and Thomas proactively presented an enhanced analysis that demonstrated how their integrated approach created multiple forms of value: financial, reputational, and strategic. Quarterly. Metrics are essential but insufficient indicators, Thomas explained, acknowledging Reed's concern while transcending its limitations. Our comprehensive performance dashboard measures both immediate returns and foundation building for sustained competitive advantage. The presentation systematically addressed each criticism while maintaining absolute commitment to the integrated framework. When Reed attempted to frame the discussion as a choice between tradition and innovation, James redirected effectively. This isn't about choosing between established wisdom and new approaches, he clarified. It's about evolution, maintaining what works from our successful history, while developing capabilities required for future success. Integration rather than opposition. Richard, having moved through his temporary wavering, supported this framing with his own perspective. Blackwell Development has survived 3 generations by adapting to changing markets while maintaining core principles. What appears to be tradition now was innovation when my father implemented it. What seems disruptive today will be established practice tomorrow. The debate continued for nearly 3 hours, with Reed's faction raising increasingly specific concerns about implementation risks and governance implications. Each question was met with substantive response rather than defensive reaction, demonstrating the robustness of our integrated approach rather than just asserting it. Gradually, the tenor of discussion shifted. Board members initially aligned with Reed began asking genuine questions rather than presenting rhetorical challenges. When the final vote came on reaffirming the 5-year strategy and co-leadership structure, Reed's motion was defeated by a significant margin, with several of his presumed allies ultimately supporting the integrated approach. As the meeting concluded, Reed approached James and Thomas with reluctant respect. "I still have reservations," he acknowledged, "but your preparation and alignment were impressive. I'll watch the results with interest." This wasn't full conversion, but it represented meaningful progress, recognition that our approach deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal as idealistic or naive. The aftermath of this confrontation revealed something significant about our integrated framework. It had developed sufficient resilience to withstand direct challenge. Rather than fragmenting under pressure, the various dimensions — business, strategy, governance structure, family relationships, and core values — had reinforced each other, creating a coherent whole stronger than its individual elements. That evening, as James and I processed the day's events in our favorite neighborhood cafe, we realized that Reed's challenge, though difficult, had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened our approach. Opposition forced us to articulate aspects we'd been implementing intuitively, James observed. Defending the framework helped us understand it more deeply, and demonstrated its practical value beyond philosophical appeal, I added. Reed's challenge was useful precisely because it demanded evidence rather than accepting aspiration. This insight helped us recognize that obstacles weren't just inevitable, but potentially valuable, forcing clarity, demanding evidence, and ultimately strengthening approaches that could withstand scrutiny. Our integrated framework had passed its first significant test, not by avoiding criticism, but by engaging it substantively and emerging more clearly articulated and thoroughly implemented. As April's challenges gradually resolved into May's opportunities, we carried this lesson forward. Meaningful integration isn't proven in ideal conditions, but in facing direct opposition to its fundamental premises. The path ahead would undoubtedly bring further challenges, but we now approached them not with apprehension, but with confidence that our framework could withstand rigorous examination and emerge stronger through the process. This resilience, maintaining coherence across dimensions even under targeted pressure, wasn't just professionally valuable, but personally meaningful. It demonstrated that the integration we sought wasn't fragile idealism, but robust reality, capable of withstanding the inevitable resistance that any significant change must face. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.